It began not with thunder, nor with lightning, but with something quieter, something almost too small to notice at first, a whisper. In the farthest corner of a small province in the Philippines, where the rice paddies stretched endlessly under the pale moon and the nights grew heavier than the days, people said there was something moving again. At first, no one dared to speak openly. Farmers would glance over their shoulders on their way home. Mothers would close their windows earlier than usual, and children were warned not to play past sundown. Yet, despite the silence, there was one truth everyone felt in their bones. The Aswang were returning. The signs were subtle. Chickens, once loud and restless, were found dead inside their coops with no wounds, their bodies pale and empty, drained of blood as though something had drunk from them without leaving a single trace. Dogs that usually barked at the slightest sound grew restless, whimpering in the dead of night, their eyes darting toward the tree line as if they could see what humans could not. Pregnant women, the most vulnerable to the aswang, began complaining of strange noises on their roofs, scratches, footsteps, and whispers that slid down through the cracks in the bamboo walls like cold smoke. One woman, Aling Marites, swore that she awoke one night to the sensation of something pressing down on her chest. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. A shadow crouched over her, its tongue long and glistening, stretching toward her swollen belly. She reached for the crucifix beside her pillow, but the shadow melted into the dark before her fingers touched it. The next morning, her husband found scratches on the roof, deep and fresh, as though something had been clawing its way inside. At first, the barrio elders dismissed it as superstition, tales meant to keep children indoors at night. But the whispers grew louder. One by one, strange events piled up like stones on a grave. Nilo, the young farmer who tended the farthest field, returned home one night pale and trembling. He said he heard his late father's voice calling to him from the trees. Soft at first, then urgent, begging him to come closer. When he stepped into the shadows, he saw eyes glowing like coals staring back at him. He ran without looking back, and when he reached home, his clothes were torn, his skin icy cold. The old men of the barrio exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the stories. The aswang could mimic the voices of loved ones, luring their victims into the dark. By then, the air in the village had changed. It was no longer just silence. It was dread. When dusk settled, the people hurried indoors, bolting doors and tying dalek above their windows. The scent of vinegar and salt lingered on doorways, desperate offerings of protection. No one lingered by the river, no one passed near the bamboo groves, and no one dared to walk alone once the garabaos began to stir uneasily in their sheds. Still, the whispers traveled faster than the wind, carrying stories from one ear to the next. They said a woman's unborn child had been taken before it ever saw the light of day. They said an old man found the body of his goat half buried, as though something had tried to drag it into the earth. They said shadows moved against the light of the full moon, shapes that were not human but not quite animal either. Every story ended the same way. The aswang are here. It was Aling Rosa, the oldest woman in the barrio, who finally spoke the words no one else dared. She gathered the children by the fire one evening, her wrinkled hands trembling as she pointed toward the iron cookware hanging on the wall. "Do you see the kawali? Do you see the cuchara?" she asked, her voice thin but steady. The children nodded, their eyes wide, their breaths shallow. "Do you see the cuchara?" she said. "Do you see the cuchara? These are not only for cooking. These are weapons, blessed by use, by fire, by generations of hands. Strike them together, make them sing, and the Aswang will flee. Remember this, for iron is the enemy of darkness. Some laughed nervously, dismissing it as the ramblings of an old woman too steeped in folklore, but others, those who had heard the scratching on their roofs, those who had smelled the foul stench in the wind, listened carefully. The whisper had become a warning, and Rosa's words gave it shape. That night, as the moon hid behind a veil of clouds, the whisper became something else entirely. A scream pierced the silence of the fields. It was not human, not animal, but something in between. A sound that seemed to twist the air and claw at the heart. Doors slammed shut, windows bolted, prayers whispered in trembling voices. The children clutched their kawali and kuchara, their knuckles white with fear. And in the distance, just beyond the flickering lights of the torches, red eyes watched, waiting for the courage of men to falter.
Aling Rosa had always been a figure caught between respect and suspicion in the barrio. She was small and bent from years of labor, her hair white as ashes, her eyes clouded yet sharp enough to pierce through a man's soul. Some said she was a hilot, a traditional healer. Others whispered that she carried secrets too old to be trusted. But whether healer or witch, no one denied that she had survived things others had not. When strange happenings began to unfold, when chickens were drained of life and unborn children were threatened, it was her name that surfaced in hushed conversations. And so one night, when the barrio could no longer carry the weight of silence, the people went to her nipa hut. The house itself was older than most of the villagers. Its bamboo walls were patched in places, its thatched roof sagged, yet it stood firmly at the edge of the rice fields, as though rooted into the earth by some force unseen. Lanterns swayed in the breeze as men and women gathered, their faces pale from sleepless nights. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, eyes darting at every sound in the darkness beyond. The smell of burning coconut oil and herbs lingered in the air. Inside, Rosa sat cross-legged on a woven mat. Before her, on the dirt floor, lay an iron kawali, blackened by decades of fire, and a large iron cuchara, dull and bent from use. They looked ordinary, the sort of things every household possessed, but the way she gazed at them made the crowd uneasy. She touched the pan with her thin fingers, then the spoon, as though she were stroking relics, not utensils. "Many of you laugh at me," she began, her voice cracked but steady. "You think my words are old wives' tales, but tell me, do chickens die without reason? Do children vanish without footprints left behind? Do you hear scratching on your roofs when the moon hides? If you believe none of this, then go back to your homes and wait for your blood to be tasted." A murmur spread among the people. Some lowered their heads in shame, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one left. They had all felt the fear, and now they needed answers. Rosa's eyes narrowed. "The Aswang are real. They always have been. You think they belong to stories, to the past, but I tell you now, they are here, and they hunger." She lifted the kawali and kuchara, holding them up so the firelight glinted off the metal. "These are your only weapons. Do not mistake them for cooking tools. Iron is poison to the Aswang. Iron burns them, cripples them. Strike them together, make them sing, and the monsters will flee." Her words settled heavily over the room. A few men exchanged doubtful glances, but the women clutched their children closer. The iron pan and spoon looked pitiful against the image of clawed beasts and shadowy figures.
but Rosa's conviction made them shine with a strange authority. One young man, brave or foolish, spoke. Aling Rosa, why would creatures of darkness fear something so simple? Why not knives? Why not spears? She gave him a long, weary look. Because iron remembers. These tools have touched fire, have fed families, have endured the hands of the living for generations. The Aswang are ancient, but so is the strength in things we call ordinary. Gawali and kuchara carry the weight of survival, and survival is the only language monsters understand. The hut fell silent. Outside, the night pressed closer, as though listening. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, a long, mournful cry that made the children whimper. The villagers shivered, for the sound carried with it something unnatural, almost mocking. Rosa did not flinch. She placed the kawali and kuchara on the floor, side by side, and poured a handful of salt over them. The metal hissed faintly, or perhaps it was only the people's imagination. Take this lesson, she said. When you hear the scratching, when you feel the air grow heavy, do not cower. Take your kawali, take your kuchara, and fight. Do not let the shadows feed. The fire sputtered as if in agreement. The villagers left her hut that night with the image burned into their minds. The old woman's frail figure holding the humble tools like weapons, her eyes gleaming with something older than fear. Some mocked her still, whispering that she had gone mad, that no pan or spoon could drive away monsters. But others, those who had heard voices in the trees or felt the weight of something unseen pressing against their roofs, carried her warning home. They placed the kawali and kuchara by their doors, just in case. Later that night, as the barrio tried to sleep, Maria, the pregnant woman who had felt a shadow crawl over her once, awoke again. This time she heard the faintest scratching above her roof. Her husband stirred beside her, remembering Rosa's words. With trembling hands, he grabbed the kawali and kuchara, banging them together with all his strength he had. The sound rang out sharp and jarring, echoing through the bamboo walls like a bell tolling for war. The scratching stopped. Outside, something leapt from the roof into the trees, moving too quickly for human eyes to follow. Maria swore she saw glowing red eyes staring back for a moment before vanishing into the darkness. Her husband's hands shook as he lowered the pan and spoon, their edges vibrating from the strike. Word spread by morning. The kawali and kuchara had saved them. Aling Rosa's secret was no longer just a story. It was truth, and the truth was terrifying. From then on, the barrio's nights were never silent again. Everywhere people struck iron against iron, a chorus of desperate clangs ringing across the fields. The sound was both shield and prayer, a defiance against the unseen hunger that lurked in the shadows. And somewhere deep in the forest, the Aswang listened, their fury rising, knowing the humans had remembered the old ways. The fear in the barrio was no longer just whispers or warnings. It became flesh when Nilo, the young farmer, disappeared. He was known to everyone, tall, broad-shouldered, with a laugh that carried across the fields. He was not the kind of man to vanish easily, not the kind to cower at shadows. That was why his absence struck deeper than 100 stories. If even Nilo could be taken, then none of them were safe. It was the middle of harvest season when it happened. Nilo had gone to the farthest edge of the fields, near the line of dark trees where no one lingered after dusk. The sun was still high when he left, carrying his bolo, whistling as he walked. By late afternoon, his wife Lena began to worry. The sky was bleeding into shades of orange and violet, and still he had not returned. She lit a lamp and went to the path, expecting to see him coming, sweat-stained and smiling, tired but alive. But the road remained empty. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the soft creak of bamboo swaying with the wind. By nightfall, panic spread. The men gathered with their lamps and bolos, forming a search party. They fanned out across the rice fields, calling his name, the flames of their torches bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. Lena followed, clutching her shawl tightly, her heart pounding against her ribs. She kept hearing something in the wind, whispers, almost like Nilo's voice, calling her softly from the trees. Once she nearly stepped into the forest, convinced he was there, but an old man grabbed her arm and pulled her back, warning her not to follow the voices. Everyone knew the stories. The Aswang could mimic the dead or the living, drawing people into their lairs. The search stretched deep into the night. Then they found the first sign. Nilo's hat lay in the grass, torn at the rim. A little farther on, his shirt ripped open as if by claws. The earth was disturbed, scattered with strange markings, half footprints, half something else, elongated and twisted. There was no blood, not a single drop, only a smell that made their stomachs churn, thick and metallic, like meat left too long in the sun. Lena fell to her knees, clutching the shirt to her chest, crying his name into the darkness. The men wanted to continue into the forest, but Rosa, who had joined them with her lantern, shook her head. "Do not go further," she warned. "The trees are not yours after dark. If you step inside, you will not return." Her face was grim, her voice sharp as a blade. The men, brave as they were, hesitated. They had children, wives, homes waiting for them. No one wanted to meet the fate that had taken Nilo. They returned to the village, silent, each man carrying the weight of his own fear. That night, Lena sat in her hut, clutching the shirt that smelled faintly of her husband's sweats and the strange rots of the forest. She refused to sleep, her ears straining for the sound of footsteps, for his laugh, for anything that might mean he was alive. Near midnight, she heard it, a knock at the door, soft but insistent. Her heart leapt. She rose, ready to fling the door open, but then she remembered Rosa's words. Do not follow the voices, do not answer the calls in the dark. She pressed her ear against the bamboo wall instead. "Lena," the voice was Nilo's, clear, familiar, tender. "It's me, open the door." Her hands shook, tears welled in her eyes. She wanted so badly to believe, but something in the tone was wrong, stretched thin like a thread about to snap. She clutched the kawali and kuchara, which Rosa had forced into her hands earlier, and banged them together with all her strength. The metallic clang reverberated through the night, harsh and desperate. The voice outside changed. It grew low, guttural, breaking apart into a growl that made her blood run cold. Something scratched against the door, nails dragging slowly across the wood, testing, probing. Lena screamed and struck the kawali again, over and over, until the sound was unbearable even to her own ears. At last, the scratching stopped. There was silence. Then the faint thud of footsteps retreating into the night. By morning, the men found new marks outside Lena's hut, deep gouges in the bamboo, shaped like claws. They saw where the earth had been disturbed, as if something heavy had crouched just outside her door, waiting. Nilo was gone, and now they understood he would never return. The Aswang had claimed him. Fear spread like wildfire. Parents kept their children indoors. Women carried iron spoons in their skirts. Men slept with pans beside their beds. The nights grew longer, each sound outside magnified, each gust of wind a possible voice luring them into the dark. Some wanted to leave the village altogether, to abandon the fields and start anew somewhere the shadows could not reach. But Rosa reminded them that the Aswang were not bound to one place. Run, and they will follow. The only choice is to fight. Nilo's disappearance became the first story told in trembling voices, the first memory etched in the hearts of the villagers. He was not just a man lost. He was proof that the whispers were real, that the monsters of their grandparents' tales had returned to walk among them. And as the sun dipped again into the horizon that evening, and the first cries of night animals echoed from the forest, the people of the barrio held their kawali and kuchara tighter, praying that the sound of iron would be enough to keep them alive. Maria had lived her whole life in the barrio, but never had the nights felt so long. Her pregnancy should have been a blessing, a reason for joy, but instead it became a burden wrapped in dread. Every story of the Aswang circled back to women like her, women carrying life in their wombs, life that the creatures craved. Her mother had warned her long ago. Pregnant women must guard themselves, for the monsters hunger for what is not yet born. Now, as the nights grew darker and the whispers louder, Maria felt those warnings like a knife pressed against her throat. Her husband, Ernesto, tried to stay strong. He kept their small nipa hut sealed tightly each evening, covering every crack with woven mats, sprinkling salt along the windowsills, and hanging garlic by the doorway. He sharpened his bolo and placed it near the bed, though Rosa's words haunted him. Blades could cut flesh, but iron alone drove away the shadows. So, beside the bolo, he laid their kawali and kuchara, ordinary tools that now carried the weight of hope. It was just past midnight when Maria awoke. At first, she thought it was only the sound of the wind tugging at the thatch roof, but then she heard it clearly, a soft, deliberate scratching. Not the playful scamper of a rat or the restless claws of a stray cat, but something larger, heavier, with purpose. The sound traveled across the roof, slow, dragging, as though nails were being tested against bamboo. Her blood froze. She reached for Ernesto, shaking him awake. His eyes opened at once, sharp with fear, as though he had been expecting this moment. The scratching grew louder, moving above them, circling. Maria clutched her belly, whispering prayers through trembling lips. Ernesto rose quietly, his hand tightening around the handle of the kawali. With his other hand, he grabbed the kuchara. The scratching stopped. Silence pressed down on the hut, heavier than the darkness. For a moment, Maria dared to hope it had gone. Then something thumped against the roof hard enough to shake dust from the beams. A shadow shifted across the ceiling, long and thin, like a body crawling above them. Ernesto's courage faltered for only a heartbeat, but then he raised the kawali and kuchara and struck them together. The sound was sharp, metallic, echoing through the walls like the strike of a great bell. It was not just noise, it was defiance, a weapon in itself. The hut seemed to vibrate with the clang. From above came a hiss, low and furious, followed by the scraping of claws retreating across the bamboo. Maria's heart pounded so hard she thought it would tear from her chest. She clung to Ernesto's arm, whispering for him to strike again. He did. The clang rang out once more, piercing the night. There was a heavy thud outside, as though something had leapt from the roof and landed on the ground. Ernesto crept to the window and peered through a slit in the mat. At first, he saw nothing but the darkness of the trees. Then, a pair of eyes, glowing red, unblinking, stared back at him from the shadows. They hovered higher than a man's, sit too far apart, burning like embers in the night. The creature shifted, its form half hidden, its limbs long and crooked. For a moment, Ernesto swore he saw wings unfurl, stretching wider than the hut itself. His breath caught in his throat. The eyes narrowed, and a guttural growl rolled across the ground like thunder. Then, as if sensing the iron clutched in his hands, the creature slipped back into the trees, vanishing so quickly Ernesto doubted his own sight. Inside, Maria wept silently, pressing her hands over her belly. Ernesto sat beside her, still holding the kawali and cuchara, his hands trembling from the effort of not collapsing into fear. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. Every time the wind rustled the trees, he raised the iron again, ready to strike, ready to drive the shadows away. By dawn, word had spread. Neighbors gathered at Maria's hut, listening as Ernesto described the glowing eyes, the scratching, the hiss. Some shook their heads in disbelief, but most believed because the fear was already in them. Others came forward with their own confessions, noises on their roofs, shadows at their windows, whispers calling their names. The attacks were not random. The Aswang were circling, testing the village, hungering for the unborn, the weak, the careless. That morning, Rosa came. She did not look surprised at Maria's story. Instead, she nodded gravely and placed her wrinkled hand on the kawali. "It will return," she said. "They do not give up so easily. But now it knows you are not helpless. That is your power. Fear makes them bold, but iron makes them flee." Maria felt no comfort in the words. She knew what Rosa meant. The battle was not won, only delayed. The creature would come again. Perhaps not for her, but for another. The barrio was no longer a home. It had become a hunting ground. And though iron had saved them once, how long could mere metal hold back monsters born of shadow? That night, as the sun sank behind the trees, every house in the barrio rang the sound of kawali and cuchara striking. The metallic chorus rose into the sky, desperate and defiant, a shield of noise against the unseen. Yet, in the distance, beyond the rice fields, red eyes flickered in the darkness, patient, waiting. The barrio did not need more proof that the Aswang were among them. But proof came anyway, carried on the cries of a midwife in the next village. Her name was Loring, a woman trusted for decades to bring children safely into the world. She had delivered babies through storms and sickness, her hands steady even when death lingered too close. But one night, her scream cut through the stillness, and that sound traveled faster than fire, reaching even the ears of those who pretended not to believe. The story was told and retold before the sun rose, though every version agreed on the same detail. The child was wrong. Loring herself, pale and trembling, swore she had seen it. The mother, a young woman barely into her 20s, had labored for hours in the sweltering heat of her nipa hut. When the baby came, silence filled the room. No soft cries, no gasping breath. Only stillness. Then, as Loring leaned closer, the infant opened its mouth. Its gums were lined with sharp teeth, small but jagged, gleaming like shards of glass in the lamplight. The baby's eyes flickered with an unnatural glow, not the cloudy innocence of a newborn, but the crimson shimmer of embers buried in ash. Loring dropped the infant in shock. It did not cry. It hissed. The mother, weak and fevered, reached out to cradle her child, but before dawn came, both mother and child were gone. No one saw them leave. No footprints were found. The neighbors swore the air itself grew heavy and that a foul stench of decay lingered long after the hut stood empty. Some whispered the Aswang had reclaimed their offspring, that the child had not been human at all, but a vessel for something older, something monstrous. Fear gripped the province tighter than ever. Women clutched their bellies at night, whispering prayers to keep their unborn safe. Men sharpened bolos, though they knew steel alone was no salvation. Even the bravest could not deny what had been seen. A child born with teeth, eyes glowing red, gone before the rooster crowed. That was no tale to frighten children. It was a warning. Maria heard the story from a neighbor, her hands trembling as she washed rice in a basin. The water spilled as she froze, her own unborn child shifting inside her. She remembered the scratching on her roof, the red eyes staring from the trees. What if they came back for her? What if her child was already marked? Ernesto placed his hand on her shoulder, but his eyes betrayed his fear. He tried to speak calmly, saying they had Rosa's guidance, that the Kawali and Kusada had saved them once and would again. Yet Maria saw how tightly he gripped the iron spoon in his other hand, as though it were the only thing keeping his courage from slipping away. The barrio grew restless. Chickens and pigs continued to vanish, but worse than the animals were the voices. Children claimed to hear their dead grandparents calling from the trees. Men reported being lured by the sound of their wives singing, only to find the rice field empty. Each story spread like wildfire, each retelling heavier with terror. The people no longer doubted. The Aswang were not just hunting, they were multiplying, growing bolder with each night. Rosa gathered the villagers once more at her hut. The Kawali and Kusada lay on the mat before her, glinting in the firelight. You see now, they want our unborn, they want our children. They will not stop, but neither will we. Remember, iron drives them back. Strike until your arms break if you must, but never let the sound of iron die in this barrio. Her words were met with silence, but it was not disbelief. It was fear, raw and suffocating, clinging to each man and woman like a second skin. That night, the barrio did not sleep. Every hut rang with the clanging of iron against iron. Kawali and Kusada striking in desperate rhythm, the metallic chorus rising into the human air. The sound echoed across the rice paddies, bouncing against the forest, a wall of defiance against the darkness. The children cried from the noise, but no one stopped. They all knew what silence would bring. And yet, in the distance, hidden among the trees, glowing eyes blinked open one by one. Dozens of them, red and unyielding, watching the flicker of firelight from the huts. The Aswang were waiting, patient as the earth itself, their hunger growing. The child born with teeth had been a sign, a promise of what was to come. Maria lay awake beside Ernesto, her hand on her belly, listening to the endless clang of iron all around her. She wanted to believe it was enough. She wanted to believe the monsters would never step closer. But in the deepest part of her heart, she knew the truth. The sound might hold them back, but it would not hold them forever. The Aswang had tasted their fear, and fear was the sweetest blood of all.
The barrio held its breath as night fell. The sun slipped behind the mountains, leaving the rice fields bathed in silver light, and with the darkness came the familiar weight of dread. The people had grown used to fear, but that night it was different. The air was thicker, the silence heavier. Even the dogs, who usually barked at shadows, whimpered quietly, their ears pinned back, their eyes fixed on the forest, as though they sensed something too terrible to name. The families gathered inside their nipa huts, doors barred by bamboo, mats nailed across windows to block even the smallest gap. Each household held its weapons, bolo, salt, garlic, but above all, iron. Kawali and Kuchara sat beside every bed, in every hand, waiting for the hour when the scratching would come. The metallic sound of iron striking iron filled the night, pans and spoons clanging again and again in desperate rhythm, echoing like war drums across the fields. But the monsters were listening too. Maria sat in the corner of her hut, clutching her belly, her face pale in the flickering light of the oil lamp. Ernesto stood near the door, spoon in one hand, pan in the other, his jaw tight. He had not spoken much that day, and she knew it was because he feared his words would betray his trembling courage. They had heard the rumors all week, more livestock torn apart, children vanishing without footprints, men tricked by voices that sounded like their dead brothers. Every story added to the weight pressing down on their chests. Then the screams began. At first, only one, a high, piercing cry that ripped through the night, coming from the northern edge of the barrio. Everyone froze, the clang of irons stopping mid-strike. The scream did not fade. It grew louder, shriller, as if whatever voice carried it was being dragged into something darker than death. Then another scream followed, this time from the opposite side of the village. Then another and another. Within minutes, the night was filled with them. A chorus of terror that seemed to claw at the bamboo walls, shaking the huts to their foundations. Children wailed, mothers pressed them to their chests, fathers swung their pans and spoons wildly, desperate to drown out the cries with iron. Maria clamped her hands over her ears, but the screams dug into her skull like needles. They were too many, too sharp, too inhuman. She looked at Ernesto, and in his wide eyes she saw the same question she held inside. Were these the voices of neighbors being slaughtered, or were they only tricks meant to tear away their sanity? Outside, shadows moved. The villagers could see them through cracks in their walls, shapes shifting between the trees, too fast, too tall, too thin. Eyes glowed red in the dark, dozens of them, watching, circling. A heavy stench spread through the air, rancid and metallic, a smell that burned in the throat and made the stomach twist. The monsters were no longer content to whisper. They were here, surrounding the barrio, filling the night with terror until courage broke. Suddenly, something slammed against a hut at the far edge of the fields. The bamboo walls buckled inward, children screamed inside, and the clanging of iron grew frantic. Shadows lapped across the roof, their claws scraping against the thatch, pulling, tearing. The father inside struck his kawali and cuchara so hard the sound rang like thunder, but the hut shook again, as though the very ground beneath it was rebelling. One by one, other huts were attacked. Claws raked bamboo walls, wings bat against thatched roofs, windows rattled under unseen hands. Everywhere, the metallic clang answered, iron against iron, desperate, unyielding. The sound carried through the barrio like a storm of defiance. Some creatures hissed and retreated into the dark, but others pressed closer, driven by hunger that no iron could fully quench. Maria gripped Ernesto's arm, her nails digging into his skin. She whispered, "Don't stop." Ernesto struck the kawali and cuchara again, harder, until the metal bit into his palms. The clang roared in the hut, filling every corner, a fragile shield between them and the night. The screams outside rose higher, blending into one endless shriek, a sound that seemed to come not from throats, but from the earth itself. It shook the huts, bent the trees, churned the very air. Maria closed her eyes, praying to God, to the saints, to anyone who might hear. She felt her child kick violently inside her, as if even the unborn could sense the evil pressing against the walls. Hours passed like years. The screaming never ceased, though sometimes it moved farther away, only to return with double its force. The people struck their pans and spoons until their arms ached, until blood blistered their palms, until the sound was no longer metal, but something raw, something human.
the sound of survival itself. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The night fell silent, unbearably silent. No screams, no scratching, no howls. Only the faint crackle of oil lamps and the ragged breathing of terrified villagers. No one dared to lower their iron. No one dared to speak. Hours crawled by until at last the first light of dawn touched the rice fields. Only then did the barrio breathe again. When the people stepped outside, they found the ground torn with claw marks, trees splintered, roofs shredded. Some huts bore deep gashes, almost split apart. But no bodies lay in the fields. No blood stained the earth. It was as though the monsters had come not to kill, but to test, to remind them that they were always waiting, always watching. The villagers gathered at Rosa's hut, exhausted, shaken. The old women looked at their blistered hands, their pale faces, and nodded grimly. This was only the beginning. The night of screams will return, and next time, it will not end with silence. Next time, they will not be satisfied to terrify. They will feed. Her words hung in the morning air, heavy as ash. The people clutched their kawali and kuchara tighter. But deep inside, each one wondered how long iron could hold back the hunger that surrounded them. The day after the night of screams, the barrio carried its silence like a wound. Men walked the rice fields with bolo in hand, not to farm, but to search for signs of what had stalked them. Women huddled near the wells, their whispers hushed, eyes darting at the forest edge as if the trees themselves had become enemies. The children clung to their mothers' skirts, too afraid to chase chickens or play in the dust. Every hut bore the scars of the night before, deep claw marks carved into bamboo walls, roofs shredded as though talons had raked through them, and mats torn into ribbons. Yet, there were still no bodies, no blood, no proof beyond what every soul had heard with their own ears. Rosa, the old Babilan, called the villagers once more. Her hut was small, but it had become their fortress of counsel, a place where fear was spoken aloud. She stood before them with the kawali and kuchara in her hands, her back hunched, her eyes fierce. "The Aswang tested us," she said. "They will not stop. Next time, they will not only scream, they will tear the life from our children, from our unborn, from our very throats. You must be ready to fight." The men nodded, though their faces were pale. They were farmers, not warriors. Their muscles were strong from tilling the land, but they had never faced monsters that shifted form, that whispered in voices of loved ones, that vanished when the rooster crowed. Ernesto gripped his spoon and pan tighter, remembering the eyes outside their hut, glowing red in the dark, unblinking. Maria watched him, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her heart twisting with fear. She wanted to believe Rosa's words, to believe that iron could save them. But in her dreams, she saw the teeth of the child born in the next village, and she wondered if even her own womb was safe. That night, the villagers gathered in groups instead of hiding alone in their huts. Fires were lit in the fields, the flames casting tall shadows on the bamboo groves. Men struck their iron again and again, keeping the sound alive, while women sang prayers under their breath, their voices shaking. The air was heavy with smoke and garlic, with salt scattered across doorways and windowsills. It was a fragile fortress, and everyone knew it. Then, the forest stirred. At first, it was only the sound of wings, soft, leathery, beating in rhythm above the trees. Then came the rustle of leaves, the cracking of branches under weight too heavy for any bird. Eyes appeared in the dark, dozens at first, then hundreds,
glowing red like embers burning in the night. The children began to cry, their mothers clutching them tighter, while the men raised their iron high. The Aswang came not with whispers this time, but with hunger. Figures leapt from the shadows, their shapes twisting as they ran. Men who became beasts, women whose jaws split wider than humanly possible, creatures whose legs bent backward like broken bamboo. Their mouths gaped with sharp teeth, their claws glistened as they slashed at the air. The fires flickered wildly as wings swept over them, filling the sky with black. The villagers shouted and struck their pans, the clang deafening, desperate. Some of the monsters recoiled at the sound, hissing as if the metal burned them, but others pressed forward. A shadow lunged at Ernesto, its limbs too long, its mouth dripping with foul saliva. He swung the kawali with all his strength, the clang ringing out as iron met flesh. The creature shrieked, smoke rising where the metal struck, and it stumbled back into the darkness. Screams erupted across the fields. A man near the well fell to the ground, a beast penning him with claws that pierced his chest. The others rushed to him, their irons striking wildly, forcing the monster away, but blood already soaked the earth. It was the first blood spilled in the barrio, and its scent drove the creatures into frenzy. Their shrieks grew louder, their movements faster, their hunger unmasked. Maria crouched near the fire, clutching her belly, her eyes darting to the shadows. She whispered prayers, but her voice cracked with terror. She could see them circling, waiting for her, for the life inside her. One creature stepped forward, its form that of a woman, hair long and matted, eyes red, teeth sharp. It smiled at her, a smile too wide, too cruel. "Sister," it hissed, voice like wind through broken bamboo. "Give me the child. It is mine." Maria screamed and Rosa appeared beside her, striking the cuchara against the kawali so hard the sound cracked like thunder. The creature recoiled, covering its ears, its body writhing as smoke curled from its skin. "Not tonight," Rosa shouted, her voice stronger than her frail body. "Not while I still breathe." The battle raged across the barrio. Iron clanged, creatures hissed, fire burned. The villages fought with desperation, each strike fueled by terror and the knowledge that their families would die if they faltered. The night was chaos, screams, fire, the clash of metal, the stink of blood and rot. Some monsters fled back into the forest, their bodies smoking from iron strikes, but others remained, circling, waiting for a moment of weakness. Hours stretched on until the eastern sky began to pale. The crowing of roosters echoed across the fields, and at once, the Aswang shrieked in fury. Their shapes blurred, their wings beat the air, and one by one they vanished into the trees, leaving only silence behind. The villagers stood trembling, their hands blistered, their clothes torn, their faces streaked with sweat and blood. 2 men lay dead, their bodies broken, their blood soaking the earth. Women wept quietly, clutching their children, while the men stared at the forest, knowing the battle was not over. Rosa lifted the kawali and cuchara, her hands shaking, but her eyes blazing. "We drove them back," she said, "but they will return, and when they do, they will come with greater hunger. Prepare yourselves. The fight has only begun."
The morning after the battle, the barrio felt hollow. Smoke still rose from the fires that had burned through the night, and the ground remained stained with blood that no one dared to wash away. The dead lay shrouded in white cloth inside their huts, their families wailing softly, the grief too deep for words. Chickens no longer crowed. Dogs hid beneath bamboo floors, and the forest at the edge of the fields stood unnervingly quiet, as though it were holding its breath. The villagers gathered in the center of the barrio, their faces gray with exhaustion, their hands blistered and raw from striking iron. The battle had proven one thing:
The Aswang could be hurt, driven back, even wounded. But it had also proven that they were not invincible. 2 men dead, several injured, blood spilled across the bamboo paths. Rosa stood among them, leaning heavily on her cane, her voice cracking as she spoke. They will come again, stronger, hungrier. We cannot wait for them to choose the hour. We must be ready to strike first. Her words unsettled the men. They were farmers, not hunters of monsters. Their lives were built on rice, buffalo, and prayers, not war. But fear and anger had been planted deep in them, and grief watered that seed until it sprouted into rage. Then tell us how, Ernesto said, stepping forward, his face gaunt, his voice iron. Tell us how to fight them before they take more of us. Rosa's gaze swept over the crowd, his face gray with exhaustion, his hands blistered and raw from striking iron. The battle had proven one thing: the Aswang could be hurt, driven back, even wounded, but it had also proven that they were not invincible. 2 men dead, several injured, blood spilled across the bamboo paths. Rosa stood among them, leaning heavily on her cane, her voice cracking as she spoke. They will come again, stronger, hungrier. We cannot wait for them to choose the hour. We must be ready to strike first. Her words unsettled the men. They were farmers, not hunters of monsters. Their lives were built on rice, buffalo, and prayers, not war. But fear and anger had been planted deep in them, and grief watered that seed until it sprouted into rage. Then tell us how, Ernesto said, stepping forward, his face gaunt, his voice iron. Tell us how to fight them before they take more of us. Rosa's gaze swept over the crowd. Iron wounds them. Fire drives them back. But these are not enough. To fight creatures born of hunger and shadow, we must bind ourselves together. A pact of blood, sealed by iron, so that none of us can falter when the darkness comes. If one falls, the others must strike harder. If one weakens, the rest must carry the weight. Alone, they will devour us. Together, we may yet endure. The crowd stirred uneasily. A pact of blood was not a small thing. It meant binding their souls to each other, swearing to fight as one until death. Some whispered that such oaths drew the attention of darker spirits, but others nodded grimly, knowing they had little choice. Maria stood near the back, her belly heavy, her body weary. She listened as her neighbors agreed, their voices trembling but resolute. She wanted to believe it would work, that unity could protect them. But in her heart, fear gnawed at her. She remembered the creature that had smiled at her during the battle, claiming her unborn child. She could still hear its hiss in her dreams, could still see its eyes burning red. A pact might shield the barrio, but would it shield the life inside her? That night, the villagers gathered again, not to wait for the Aswang, but to forge their pact. A fire blazed in the center of the fields, its flames reaching high, sparks scattering like stars. Rosa stood at its edge, the kawali and kuchara gleaming in her hands. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, each pricking a finger with a blade, letting blood drip into the flames. The fire hissed and cracked with each drop, the smell sharp and metallic in the air. Then Rosa struck the kawali with the kuchara, the sound ringing like a bell across the fields. "By iron and by blood," she declared, her voice fierce despite her age, "we bind ourselves, to fight, to endure, to protect. Let the monsters hear it and tremble." The villagers repeated the words, their voices rising together, carried by fear, grief, and determination. The clang of iron echoed again and again, the sound carrying into the forest. For a moment, the air felt charged, heavy with something unseen. Maria shivered, pressing her hand to her belly, as though the child inside stirred at the weight of the oath. But as the fire burned lower, a sound drifted from the trees. It was not a scream this time, nor the hiss of wings. It was laughter, low, mocking, inhuman. The villagers froze, their eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. The laughter grew louder, spreading from one side of the forest to the other, surrounding them.
as if it were the Aswang that had been listening all along, amused by their rituals, entertained by their defiance. Rosa struck the iron again, her hands trembling, but the laughter did not fade. Instead, it shifted, turning into voices, familiar voices. Mothers heard the cries of children they had lost years ago. Men heard the laughter of dead brothers. Maria heard her own mother's voice, soft and gentle, calling her name from the trees. Her heart clenched, her eyes filled with tears. She knew it was a trick, but knowing did not dull the ache. "Do not listen," Rosa shouted, her voice cutting through the illusion. "They want your grief, your weakness. Do not give it." The villagers struck their iron harder, the clangs ringing through the night, trying to drown the voices. Yet the sound of the dead wove itself between the strikes, whispering, coaxing, pulling at their hearts. Then, without warning, a young man broke from the circle. His eyes were wide, his face pale, his lips trembling as he cried out, "Nanai!" He stumbled toward the trees, reaching for the voice of his dead mother. The others shouted, but before they could stop him, the forest swallowed him whole. His scream tore through the night, sharp and final, before silence returned. The laughter rose again, cruel and triumphant, echoing across the fields. The villagers huddled closer to the fire, their pact sealed, but their courage shaken. Maria clutched her belly so hard her nails dug into her skin, her tears streaming freely. She felt her child kick once more, restless, as if even the unborn could sense the mockery in the air. Rosa's eyes burned as she lifted the iron high. "They test us still," she said, her voice raw, "but the pact is made. We are bound by blood now, and blood they will taste, either theirs or ours." The fire crackled, the laughter faded, but the fear lingered. The pact had been forged, yet, already, the Aswang had claimed another life. The villagers knew then what Rosa had always known. The price of survival was not unity alone. It was sacrifice. And the night would demand more before it was through.
The night of the pact left the barrio shaken, their courage tested, their blood already spilled. Yet even in grief, the villagers clung to their promise, bound together by iron and sacrifice. They knew the Aswang would not wait long. The creatures had laughed at their oath, claimed another life before dawn, and melted back into the trees as if daring the people to strike first. Every soul in the barrio understood. The next night would be war. The day passed in a haze of preparation. Men sharpened balos until their blades gleamed like mirrors. Women brewed stronger mixtures of garlic and vinegar, smearing the pungent concoctions on doorways, on the foreheads of their children, even on their own skin. Salt was scattered across thresholds, across fields, across the very earth. And still, none of it felt like enough. The air was too still, the sun too dim, as though even the sky knew what was coming. Maria moved slowly through her hut, her belly heavy, her strength waning. Each step was a struggle, but her spirit remained fierce. She whispered prayers as she prepared the kawali and kutsara, polishing them with trembling hands. Ernesto stayed close to her, his jaw set, his eyes burning with the determination of a man who knew he might not live to see another sunrise, but refused to bow to fear. Rosa, though frail, spent the day carving strange symbols into the handles of the iron tools, muttering chants that sounded older than the mountains. She said little, but her eyes carried the weight of prophecy. When night fell, the barrio gathered once more in the open fields. Fires blazed brighter than before, their smoke thick and acrid. The people stood in a circle, the clang of iron beginning its endless rhythm. The sound was no longer frantic. It was steady, solemn, like the heartbeat of the village itself. The pact bound them together, and they struck the metal not only to ward off evil, but to remind themselves they were not alone. The forest answered. It began with the rustle of wings, then the snap of branches, then the guttural hiss of voices that were not human.
Red eyes blinked open in the shadows, more than ever before, a sea of embers stretching along the tree line. The laughter came again, low and cruel, rolling across the fields like thunder. Then the creatures poured forth. They came in a flood, twisted shapes that blurred between man and beast, wings that blotted out the stars, jaws that unhinged like snakes. The ground shook beneath their charge, and the air filled with the stench of rot. The villagers shouted, striking their iron with renewed fury. Sparks flew as pans and spoons clashed, the sound deafening, cutting through the shrieks of the monsters. The first clash was brutal. A beast leapt upon a farmer, its claws tearing into his chest. But 3 men rushed to his side, their iron striking again and again until the creature shrieked and burst into smoke. Another swooped down from above, wings slamming into the fire, scattering embers across the field. Children screamed, mothers shielded them, and men swung their balos wildly, iron ringing out as the creature recoiled. Maria clutched her belly, crouching near the flames, her body trembling. She could feel the child inside her twisting violently, as though it too sensed the battle. One of the creatures crawled closer, its form grotesquely human, its eyes fixed on her. "The child is ours," it hissed, its voice echoing in her skull. She screamed, lifting the kawali with all her strength, and slammed it against the kutsara. The clang rang out like a bell, and the creature shrieked, smoke curling from its skin. But still it reached, closer, closer, until Ernesto struck it across the head with such force the iron dented and the monster crumbled into ash. All around them the fight raged. Villagers fell, but others rose in their place. The iron clanged without end, the pact holding them together even as blood stained the earth. Rosa stood at the center of the circle, her frail body glowing in the firelight, her voice rising in chants that cut through the chaos. Each word she spoke seemed to burn the monsters, forcing them back, but it also drained her, her body trembling, sweat pouring down her face. Then the largest of the Aswang appeared, a figure taller than any man, its wings stretching wide, its eyes burning like coals. Its mouth split open into a grin, rows of teeth glistening. The villagers faltered at the sight, their courage wavering. But Rosa stepped forward, raising the kawali and kutsara high above her head. "By blood and by iron, you shall not take this barrio," she cried, her voice breaking. The creature lunged, its claws reaching for her, but Rosa struck the iron together with such force the sound shattered the night. It was not merely a clang, it was thunder, lightning, the roar of the earth itself. The monster shrieked, its body convulsing, smoke pouring from its skin. Rosa collapsed, her strength spent. But the villagers surged forward, striking their iron in unison. The sound rose into a storm, louder and louder, until the ground shook and the air itself seemed to tear apart. One by one, the creatures fell back, their forms dissolving into ash, their screams fading into nothingness. The great one writhed, its wings burning, its body crumbling under the assault of iron and flame. With the final, terrible shriek, it burst apart, scattering into the wind like dust. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breaths of the survivors. The fires burned low, the fields littered with ash. Rosa lay on the ground, her chest barely rising. Maria knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. The old woman's eyes fluttered open, her voice a whisper. "The pact holds. You will live. Protect the child. It will be your strength when I am gone." With that, her eyes closed, and the barrio's last babailan breathed her final breath. Dawn broke over the rice fields, pale light washing away the horrors of the night. The survivors stood together, weary but unbroken, their hands blistered, their hearts scarred. The Aswang had been driven back, perhaps for years, perhaps only for nights, but the pact bound them still,
and the clang of iron would never fade from their ears. Maria looked at Ernesto, her hand resting on her belly. She did not know what the future held, whether her child would be marked or spared, but she knew one thing: the barrio had endured. And as long as they held their kawali and kutsara, as long as they struck iron against iron, they would never face the darkness alone.